Today's story of blood, dust, and betrayal is Revenge on a Rancher. It begins like this. Anthony Walker never considered himself the perfect husband, but he knew one thing. He loved Lena. He worked in financial consulting, earning enough to provide a comfortable life for both of them, and he thought they were happy. He was used to long hours at the office, constant stress, and endless client calls. Sometimes, when he came home late at night, he would find Lena already asleep or lost in her phone. He chalked up her growing distance to the usual complaints of a wife who felt neglected. But everything changed on one ordinary evening. His phone rang. "Hey, where are you right now?" It was Michael, his best friend. "Just leaving the office." "Why?" There was a pause. "Listen, I just saw Lena, and, man, you need to see this." "What?" "Where?" "West End, a hostel, and she wasn't alone." Anthony frowned. A hostel. Lena had no reason to be there. She always looked down on cheap hotels. "You must be mistaken." "I wish I was, but I took a photo." A message notification popped up. When Anthony opened it, something inside him twisted. The image showed Lena in a short dress, her arms wrapped around two men outside a dimly lit hostel. They were laughing, one of them playfully smacking her on the hip. The expression on her face wasn't one of discomfort. It was of familiarity. Anthony stopped walking. The world around him blurred. "Tony, you still there?" His hand clenched into a fist around the phone. "Yeah." "Listen, man, I don't know what this means, but I figured you should know." Anthony swallowed hard. His first instinct was to go there, to catch her in the act, to demand answers. But then something else took over. A cold, calculating calm. "Thanks, Mike. Don't tell anyone else about this." "What are you gonna do?" Anthony took a deep breath. "I'm going to find out everything." Anthony stood on the sidewalk, staring at the photo on his phone. His mind was racing, but his face remained emotionless. Anger, pain, humiliation, all of it simmered beneath the surface, but he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and made a decision. He wasn't going to confront Lena. Not yet. He needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence. And he needed a plan. Hiring the investigator. The next morning, Anthony made a call. "James Carter Investigations. How can I help you?" "I need to hire a private investigator." "What's the case?" "Infidelity." An hour later, Anthony sat across from James Carter, a seasoned private investigator in his late 50s. The man had the look of someone who had seen it all. Sharp eyes, a calm demeanor, and an air of quiet confidence. "So, tell me everything," James said, pulling out a notepad. Anthony slid his phone across the desk, showing him the picture of Lena with the two men. "This is my wife," he said, voice steady. "I need to know how long this has been going on, who they are, and where they meet." James studied the photo for a moment before nodding. "I'll get started immediately. Do you want me to be discreet?" "I don't want her to have the slightest idea that I'm on to her." "Understood. I'll keep you updated." As Anthony walked out of the investigator's office, he felt the first spark of control return. He wouldn't let emotions dictate his actions. If Lena had betrayed him, she would face the consequences. The first reports. A week passed. Anthony kept his routine the same, acting as if nothing had changed. He came home late, kissed Lena on the cheek, made small talk over dinner. He watched her closely. Every movement, every glance at her phone, every excuse to go out. Then the first report came in. James sent him a folder filled with photos and logs. Lena had been meeting the same two men regularly. She wasn't just having an affair. She was leading a double life. Different hotels, different times, even different names. One of the men, Eric Malone, was a married businessman. The other, Jake Simmons was a younger bartender. Both had no idea about each other. Anthony's grip tightened on the folder. So she wasn't just cheating, she was playing all of them. He closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and smirked. "You have no idea what's coming, Lena." Anthony spent the next few days refining his plan. He wasn't just going to expose Lena, he was going to destroy her carefully built lies and leave her with nothing. The betrayal had cut deep, but he wouldn't let it ruin him. Instead, he would use it as fuel. James continued tailing Lena, collecting video footage and financial records. Turns out, she was paying for hotel rooms with their joint account, making it laughably easy to track her movements. One afternoon, James handed Anthony a USB drive. "Everything you need is here," James said. "Footage, conversations, receipts, you name it." Anthony took the drive, nodding. "Good. Time for the next step." Anthony planned everything carefully. Their friend's birthday party was coming up, a perfect opportunity. He booked a large screen projector and arranged for a special video presentation during the party. The night of the event, Lena arrived looking radiant, completely unaware that this would be the night her world crumbled. Midway through the party, Anthony tapped his glass. "Everyone, I have a little surprise." Lena smiled, assuming he was about to say something sweet. The room dimmed as the projector flickered to life. Instead of a birthday tribute, the screen showed Lena, walking into hotels, kissing Eric in one clip, laughing with Jake in another. The footage was undeniable. Gasps filled the room. "What the hell is this?" Lena shouted, her face draining of color. "This, my dear wife, is a compilation of your greatest hits," Anthony said coolly. "I just thought everyone should see the real you." Lena's friends backed away, whispering. Her excuses died in her throat. There was no way out. Lena thought she could divorce Anthony and take half of everything. But what she didn't know was that he had already moved all his assets. When she angrily stormed home that night, she screamed, "I'll take you for everything you have." Anthony chuckled, tossing a stack of bank statements onto the table. "Actually, you'll be leaving with nothing. I transferred all my assets last week. You'll be walking away in debt." Lena's jaw dropped. She reached for her phone, but Anthony held up another document. "Oh, and one more thing. Eric's wife? She knows everything now." Panic flashed in Lena's eyes. "No. Yes." That night, she packed her bags and left, but she wasn't done yet. 2 weeks later, she came back with shocking news. "Anthony, I'm pregnant." Anthony sat in silence, staring at Lena. She stood in the doorway of their former home, her expression a mix of desperation and triumph. "I'm pregnant," she repeated, placing a hand on her stomach. Anthony leaned back, crossing his arms. "And I'm supposed to believe it's mine?" Lena flinched. "Of course it's yours. Who else?" Anthony let out a humorless laugh. "Lena, you were sleeping with 2 men, maybe more. So tell me, are you actually sure who the father is? Or are you just hoping I'm stupid enough to take responsibility?" Lena's eyes darted around, looking for a way to regain control. "Look, I know I messed up, but I love you. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We were happy once." Anthony's expression remained unreadable. "You didn't make a mistake. You made repeated, deliberate choices. Now you want to erase them because suddenly you need me?" Lena's voice cracked. "I don't have anyone else." Anthony stood up, towering over her. "That's not my problem." The DNA test Lena kept pushing, but Anthony wasn't going to be played again. "Fine," he finally said. "Let's do a DNA test. If the baby is mine, we'll figure something out. If not, you never contact me again." Lena hesitated. That moment of uncertainty told Anthony everything. She wasn't sure. The truth is revealed 2 weeks later. The results came in. 0% probability of paternity. Anthony looked at the paper, unsurprised. He handed it to Lena without a word. Tears welled in her eyes. Anthony, please. You lied about everything. And now, you tried to trap me with a child that isn't mine? He shook his head. You disgust me. Lena sobbed. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? Anthony gave her a cold smile. That's not my problem either. He shut the door in her face. Lena Carter was officially out of his life. Anthony packed a bag. He needed a new start, a new place, a new life, somewhere far away from all of this. He didn't know where he was headed yet, but he knew one thing for sure. His past was dead. His future was unwritten, and he was ready to start over. Anthony didn't look back as he drove out of the city. He had no destination in mind, just the open road and the promise of something new. His phone buzzed. A message from Michael. You sure about this, man? Leaving everything behind? Anthony smirked and typed back. Everything that mattered was already gone. With nowhere to be and no one waiting for him, Anthony kept driving, letting the miles blur together. Hours turned into a full day, and exhaustion finally crept in. He pulled into a roadside diner somewhere in Texas, rubbing his temples. The place smelled of coffee and old leather, and the only customers were a few truckers and a waitress who looked like she had seen it all. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed again. This time, a call. Uncle James. Anthony hesitated before answering. Didn't expect to hear from you, he said. Didn't expect you to disappear, James replied. Michael told me enough. Sounds like you could use a fresh start. Anthony exhaled. You offering one? Could be. You remember my ranch in Montana? Anthony did. As a kid, he spent a few summers there, helping out, learning how to ride, how to fix things with his hands. It had been years since he last visited. You still raising cattle? Trying to. It's been tough. Could use an extra set of hands, and you could use a place to lay low. Anthony thought about it. He had nowhere else to go. I'm on my way. Montana stretched wide before him as he pulled onto the familiar dirt road. The Walker Ranch wasn't the biggest in the area, but it had heart. The old wooden house, the fields rolling out toward the horizon. It felt different from the city. Quieter. Like he could breathe again. James, now in his late 50s, stood on the porch, arms crossed. He was lean, tough, and had the same sharp eyes Anthony remembered from childhood. You look like hell, James said, offering a firm handshake. You should see the other guy, Anthony smirked. James chuckled. Come on inside. You got work to do in the morning. The routine hit hard, but Anthony welcomed it. 5 a.m., wake up. 6 a.m., feed the horses and cattle. 8 a.m., repair fences, check water lines. 12 p.m., lunch. 1 p.m. to 6 p.m., more work, riding out to check on the herd, training the younger horses, fixing whatever was broken. 7 p.m., dinner and exhaustion. The work was brutal, but it was exactly what he needed. Something to keep his hands busy and his mind too tired to wander back to the past. There was only one problem. The neighboring ranch. The Blackwood estate, owned by Richard Blackwood, had been a thorn in James's side for years. Blackwood wanted Walker Ranch land and wasn't above using dirty tricks to get it. One evening, while fixing a fence line near the border, Anthony noticed hoof prints leading onto their land. Fresh ones. Someone had been trespassing. James sighed when Anthony mentioned it. Blackwood's been pushing for years. Be careful around his men. They don't play fair. Anthony smirked. Neither do I. The unexpected arrival. 2 days later, a black truck pulled into the ranch. A woman stepped out, tall, confident, with piercing green eyes. Where's Uncle James? She asked. James came outside, grinning. "Charlotte, you're finally home." Charlotte Walker, James's daughter and Anthony's cousin. They hadn't seen each other in over a decade. When she turned to Anthony, her expression hardened. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, well, life's funny like that." She crossed her arms. "You planning on sticking around?" Anthony smirked. "Guess we'll find out." Charlotte wasn't convinced, and judging by the tension in her eyes, she had her own reasons for coming back. One thing was certain. Life on this ranch was about to get a whole lot more interesting. A week passed, and Anthony had settled into life at Walker Ranch. The physical labor grounded him, gave him purpose. But the tension between the Walkers and the neighboring Blackwood estate never faded. One evening, while Anthony was checking the farthest fence line, he saw her. A woman on horseback, riding across the Blackwood land, her silhouette framed against the setting sun. Her long, dark hair flowed behind her, and even from a distance, Anthony could tell she rode like she belonged to the land itself. She hadn't seen him yet, and he could have left it at that. But something about her made him pause. Then she looked up and met his gaze. The woman from Blackwood. Later that evening, James mentioned the Blackwoods again. "Old man Blackwood has a daughter, you know," he muttered over dinner. "Eleanor Blackwood. Beautiful, but trouble. Just like her father." Anthony frowned. "Trouble how?" James leaned back in his chair. "She's got her own mind, doesn't always agree with her father's ways, but she's still a Blackwood, and that means she's off limits. Got it?" Anthony smirked, but said nothing. The problem was, he'd already decided he wanted to see her again. An unplanned encounter. The next day, Anthony rode along the edge of the property again, hoping, though he wouldn't admit it, that he might run into her. He didn't have to wait long. A rustling in the trees, the soft sound of hooves, and then she emerged. Eleanor Blackwood. "You lost, cowboy?" she teased, guiding her horse closer. Anthony kept his expression neutral. "Just making sure your family isn't stealing more land." She laughed. A real laugh. "You always this charming?" "Depends on who I'm talking to." She studied him, as if deciding whether he was worth her time. "I heard about you," she said. "The Walker family's mysterious new ranch hand." "That's me." She tilted her head. "Why would a guy like you end up in a place like this?" Anthony hesitated. He wasn't about to spill his past to a Blackwood. Just needed a change. She didn't push. "Well, Walker, if you're looking for excitement, you won't find it fixing fences all day." Anthony raised a brow. "You offering something better?" She smiled. "Maybe." And just like that, the game had begun. A dangerous romance. Their encounters became more frequent. At first, just small moments, passing each other on horseback, stolen glances. Then, secret conversations beneath the stars. And finally, the night everything changed. It was after midnight when Eleanor rode up to Walker Ranch. "You're insane," Anthony whispered as she dismounted. "If your father finds out—" "He won't." She stepped closer. "Unless you plan on telling him?" Anthony exhaled, shaking his head. "You're making this dangerous for both of us." She grinned. "Isn't that what makes it exciting?" Then, before he could say another word, she kissed him. And for the first time in a long time, Anthony stopped thinking. The aftermath. Their secret didn't stay secret for long. A few weeks later, James caught Anthony sneaking back into the house late at night. "Tell me you're not doing what I think you're doing," he said, arms crossed. Anthony didn't answer. James sighed. "You better hope this doesn't start a war." But to everyone's surprise, it did the opposite. When Blackwood found out, he was furious. But Eleanor? She stood her ground. "You've always wanted this fight with the Walkers," she told her father. "But I'm done with it. We're either family or we're enemies. You decide. And after years of conflict, the two ranches finally called a truce. A future worth fighting for Anthony had come here to escape the past. He never expected to find something worth staying for. Eleanor wasn't just a beautiful distraction. She was his new beginning. And for the first time in years, Anthony Walker had something to fight for. The truce between the Walkers and the Blackwoods was uneasy at first. The workers on both ranches had been raised to see each other as enemies, and trust was slow to build. But Anthony? He didn't care about old grudges. All he cared about was Eleanor. Their relationship, once secret, was now out in the open. Some disapproved. Others watched with curiosity. But neither Anthony nor Eleanor paid them any mind, until the night someone tried to burn down the Blackwood barn. Fire in the night, Anthony woke to the smell of smoke and the distant sound of shouting. He bolted upright, grabbed his boots, and ran outside. Across the field, flames rose into the sky. The Blackwood barn was on fire. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the blaze. By the time he arrived, Blackwood men were already working to control the fire, throwing buckets of water and pulling horses from the stalls. Eleanor stood among them, her face streaked with soot. "We got most of the animals out, but," she coughed, pointing, "there are still 3 inside." Anthony didn't wait. He ripped off his jacket, covered his face, and ran straight into the burning barn. The rescue inside, the heat was unbearable. Flames licked the wooden beams and smoke choked the air. The 3 horses, terrified, were kicking at their stalls. Anthony moved fast, untying them one by one. "Come on, come on!" One of the beams cracked and fell, missing him by inches. Sweat dripped from his face as he led the last horse toward the exit. Just as he reached the door, another explosion rocked the barn. Something slammed into Anthony's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. For a second, all he could see was smoke and fire. Then, through the haze, Eleanor appeared. "Anthony!" She grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet, and together they stumbled outside just as the roof collapsed behind them. A suspicious attack. The fire was finally put out by morning, but the barn was a total loss. And worse, it wasn't an accident. Blackwood and Walker men gathered near the burned ruins, whispering among themselves. "This was arson," James said grimly. "Someone wanted this place gone." Anthony exchanged a look with Eleanor. They both knew the truth. Someone still didn't want peace between the ranches. And now, Anthony had a new enemy to hunt down. The fire had changed everything. The fragile peace between the Walkers and the Blackwoods was shaken. Suspicion spread like wildfire. Who did it? Some Blackwood men thought it was the Walkers, an attack disguised as an accident. Others whispered about old rivalries, convinced someone from outside had stirred the flames. Anthony knew one thing. Whoever did this wasn't done. A silent warning. A few days later, Eleanor rode out to the fields early in the morning. She expected peace. She found a warning. A dead calf lay at the far end of the ranch, its body marked with a crude X carved into its hide. It wasn't just slaughter. It was a message. When Anthony arrived, her hands were shaking. "This isn't about our families anymore." Eleanor's voice was low. "This is about us." Anthony's jaw tightened. He looked around the empty fields, feeling unseen eyes watching. "Then we make them regret it." A plan for justice. Anthony and James rode into town that night, meeting an old friend, a man who had once worked as a bounty hunter. The man listened as they explained the fire, the threats, and the marked calf. "Sounds like someone wants you off that land," he finally said. "The question is, who?" The bounty hunter agreed to investigate quietly. In the meantime, Anthony made his own plans. He wasn't just going to sit back and wait for the next attack. A midnight confrontation. A week passed. The bounty hunter had a lead. Someone had been seen sneaking near the Blackwood property at night. Anthony and James set up a watch. One night, just before midnight, they saw a shadow moving near the cattle fence. Anthony pulled his revolver. James did the same. "You see that?" James whispered. "Yeah." They crept closer. The shadow moved fast, but Anthony was faster. "Hold it right there," he shouted, stepping into the moonlight. The figure froze. Then he turned, and Anthony's blood ran cold. It was someone they knew. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Betrayal runs deep. The man smirked, stepping forward. Now, no need for guns, Walker." James swore under his breath. Son of a, because standing before them, with dust on his boots and guilt in his eyes, was one of the Blackwoods' own men. Someone who had been part of the family for years. And now he was the one trying to tear it all apart. Anthony tightened his grip on the revolver, his heart pounding. "You better start talking, Will," James growled. Will Turner, a longtime Blackwood ranch hand, smirked in the moonlight. "Ain't much to talk about." His voice was casual, but his eyes flicked toward the tree line, like he was waiting for someone. Anthony stepped forward. "The fire, the calf, that was you, wasn't it?" Will shrugged. "Does it matter?" Anthony's knuckles went white around the gun. "You set a fire that nearly killed my girl. Yeah, it matters." Will's smirk vanished. "Your girl?" He spat. "You mean Blackwood's little princess?" He shook his head. "You don't get it, do you, Walker? Some of us ain't so happy about you two shacking up." James took a step closer, voice low. "Who put you up to this?" Will hesitated, then grinned again. "You're asking the wrong question, boys." Then, before either of them could react, he threw a punch. A fight in the dark. The hit landed against Anthony's jaw, knocking him back. James lunged, grabbing Will by the collar, but Will twisted free, driving an elbow into James's ribs. Anthony recovered fast. Too fast for Will. With a hard right hook, he sent the traitor crashing into the dirt. Will groaned, rolling over. His lip was split, his confidence gone. Anthony grabbed him by the shirt, hauling him up. "Who hired you?" His voice was sharp, deadly. Will just laughed. "Go to hell." Anthony threw him back down. James cursed under his breath. "We should just put a bullet in him." Anthony exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "Nah." He glared at Will. "We take him to Blackwood. Let the old man deal with him." Will's face finally changed. He looked scared. But Anthony didn't care. It was time for some damn answers. The truth comes out. By the time they dragged Will back to the Blackwood ranch, the house was awake. Eleanor rushed outside the moment she saw Anthony. What happened? Anthony didn't answer. He shoved Will forward. "Ask him." The old man, Jeremiah Blackwood, stepped onto the porch, his face dark. Will swallowed hard. "Boss, Enough." Blackwood's voice was cold. "Inside. Now." The entire Blackwood family, Eleanor included, gathered around as Will finally told the truth. A darker enemy. "It wasn't just me," Will muttered. "I was paid." Anthony's stomach twisted. "By who?" Will hesitated. Then finally, he said it. A name Anthony never expected. A name that made Eleanor gasp. Because the person behind the attacks was her own uncle. The room fell into stunned silence. Anthony's grip tightened around Will's collar. "Say that again." His voice was ice. Will licked his split lip, eyes flicking toward Eleanor. "It was your uncle, miss." He swallowed hard. "William Blackwood." Eleanor staggered back. "That's impossible." Her voice trembled. "Uncle Will left town years ago. My father hasn't spoken to him since." Jeremiah Blackwood's face darkened. "That bastard." Anthony turned to the old man. You knew? Jeremiah exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I knew he held a grudge. His voice was low. But I never thought he'd come back for revenge. James, who had been silent until now, crossed his arms. What the hell does he want? Will let out a weak chuckle. What do you think? He spat blood onto the floor. He wants everything. A family's dark past. Eleanor's hands were shaking. I don't understand. She looked at her father. What happened between you and Uncle Will? Jeremiah hesitated. Then, with a heavy sigh, he sat down. Your uncle always wanted this ranch for himself. His voice was tired, bitter. When your grandfather passed, he left it to me. Will never forgave that. Anthony frowned. So he just left? Jeremiah shook his head. Number. He tried to take it. Eleanor's eyes widened. Tried to? He hired men, paid off workers to turn against me. Jeremiah's voice hardened. We fought. He lost. James whistled. And now he's back for a second round. Will, still on the floor, grinned. And this time, he ain't alone. Preparing for war, Anthony and James dragged Will to the sheriff the next morning. The lawman, a tough gray-haired man named Sheriff Tate, listened carefully. William Blackwood, huh? He leaned back in his chair. Haven't heard that name in a long time. Anthony crossed his arms. What can you do? Tate sighed. Not much, unless he makes a move. Anthony cursed under his breath. Then we'll be ready when he does. They rode back to the ranch, knowing one thing for sure. War was coming. And this time, it was personal. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The air was thick with tension, and even Eleanor, who usually had something to say, sat stiffly in her saddle. Anthony's mind was racing. William Blackwood wasn't just any man. He was a ghost from the past, a man fueled by years of resentment. And now he was coming for them. When they arrived, Jeremiah was already waiting on the porch. Well, he asked. Sheriff can't do anything until William makes a move, Anthony said, swinging off his horse. Jeremiah scoffed. Then we best be ready. James, always the practical one, cracked his knuckles. How many men does he have? Anthony glanced at Eleanor. Will said he wasn't alone. He turned to Jeremiah. Any idea what that means? The old man sighed. If I know my brother, it means he's been gathering men for years. Gunslingers, drifters, people with nothing to lose. Eleanor shuddered. We can't fight an army. Anthony met her gaze. Then we don't fight alone. Calling in old debts over the next few days, Blackwood Ranch became a fortress. Anthony and James spent hours reinforcing the fences and checking the supplies. Jeremiah sent word to old allies, ranchers who owed him favors, cowboys who remembered William's treachery. By the end of the week, 10 riders arrived at the ranch, all armed and ready. Among them was Hank Lawson, a grizzled ex-bounty hunter, and Charlie Dunn, a sharpshooter with a reputation for never missing his mark. Didn't think I'd ever set foot here again, Hank muttered, looking around. Jeremiah nodded. Didn't think I'd ever ask you to. Hank spit into the dirt. William Blackwood was a bastard then. I doubt he's improved. Anthony smirked. He hasn't. The first attack. They didn't have to wait long. That night, Anthony was standing watch when he heard the sound of hooves. A group of riders approached, their torches flickering in the darkness. Then came a gunshot. Wood splintered as a bullet slammed into the barn door. Anthony didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and fired back, the shot whistling through the night. James burst out of the house, gun in hand. We got company! The ranch erupted into chaos. Gunfire, yelling, hooves pounding. William Blackwood had made his move, and Anthony was ready. The gunfight tore through the silence of the night like a wildfire. Anthony ducked behind a water trough as bullets whizzed past, kicking up dirt and splinters. James was beside him, reloading his rifle with a calm efficiency that only years on a ranch could teach. Across the yard, Hank crouched behind a barrel, returning fire with deadly precision. Charlie Dunn, the sharpshooter, had taken position on the barn's roof, his rifle picking off riders in the dim torchlight. From the darkness, a voice rang out. "You think you can hold out forever, brother?" Anthony's blood went cold. William Blackwood had arrived. A family face-off. Jeremiah stepped forward from the porch, shotgun in hand. "You should have stayed gone, Will." A tall figure on horseback emerged from the shadows. William Blackwood looked like a man who had spent years chasing ghosts. His beard was thick, his eyes dark and hollow. But his smile, that was still the same. "And miss all this?" William chuckled. "I don't think so." Anthony stepped up beside Jeremiah, his own gun raised. "You brought a lot of men for someone who wants a fair fight." William smirked. "I never said anything about fair." With a flick of his wrist, he signaled to his men. More riders appeared from the tree line, their guns raised. There were more of them than Anthony had expected, at least 20. Hank muttered a curse. "This ain't good." The ranchers strike back. But Blackwood Ranch wasn't going down without a fight. "Now!" Anthony shouted. The ranch hands fired in unison, forcing William's men to scatter. James threw a lantern into the dirt, lighting up the battlefield. The fight turned into a whirlwind of smoke, gunfire, and chaos. Charlie Dunn took out 2 men before they even reached the fence. Hank tackled a rider off his horse, slamming the man's head into the dirt. Eleanor, rifle in hand, stood beside Anthony. "We need to end this," she yelled over the gunfire. Anthony nodded, and then he saw his chance. William had moved away from his men, reloading behind an overturned wagon. Anthony didn't hesitate. A shot in the dark. He sprinted toward William, dodging bullets, his gun raised. William turned just as Anthony pulled the trigger. The bullet slammed into William's shoulder. He staggered back, cursing. "Damn you, boy." Anthony grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wagon. "It's over, Will." But William grinned through the pain. "You sure about that?" Anthony barely had time to react before a knife flashed in the firelight. The blade flashed in the firelight as William lunged. Anthony barely dodged, the knife slicing through his shirt. He grabbed William's wrist, struggling to wrestle the weapon away. The ranch burned around them. Gunfire, shouting, the crackle of flames. But in that moment, it was just the 2 of them. "You always thought you were better than me?" William growled, pressing forward. Anthony gritted his teeth, using all his strength to push back. "No, Will," he said, twisting his enemy's arm. "I just didn't waste my life on revenge." With a final, powerful shove, Anthony slammed William's hand against the wagon, forcing him to drop the knife. William staggered, but before Anthony could react, he pulled a revolver from his belt. Too slow. Anthony threw himself to the ground as the gun fired. The bullet whizzed past his head. Before William could fire again, a single gunshot rang out. William's body jerked back. His gun slipped from his fingers. He collapsed onto the dirt, blood staining his coat. Anthony looked up, breathing hard. Eleanor stood a few feet away, rifle still raised. "You okay?" she asked. Anthony let out a shaky breath, nodding. William groaned, clutching his chest. "It's not over." Anthony stepped forward, looking down at the man who had caused so much destruction. "Yes, it is." And with that, William Blackwood's reign of terror ended. The aftermath, the battle was over. William's men, seeing their leader fall, scattered into the night. The ranch was damaged, but still standing. The fire was put out. The wounded were tended to. As the sun began to rise, Anthony stood on the porch, watching the land he had fought to protect. Eleanor joined him, leaning against the railing. "What now?" she asked. Anthony exhaled. "Now, we rebuild." She smiled. "Together?" He turned to her, taking her hand. Together, a new future. With William gone, the feud between the ranches finally ended. Anthony and Eleanor's relationship grew stronger. Their love, once built on rivalry, now stood on trust and respect. And as Blackwood Ranch began to thrive again, Anthony realized something. This wasn't just a place he had come to escape. It was home.